Millionaire woman sees a dirty man at a gas station, realizes it's her childhood love, the Arizona sun, was beginning its descent as Victoria Summers pulled her pristine white Mercedes into a weathered gas station on the outskirts of Phoenix. She rarely stopped at places like this. Her assistant usually handled such mundane tasks, but the conference call had run long, and the fuel gauge had dipped into the red zone. At 42, Victoria commanded a pharmaceutical empire worth over $200 million, but even she couldn't negotiate with an empty tank. The gas station was a relic from another era, its faded signs and cracked concrete a stark contrast to the gleaming corporate corridors she inhabited. Victoria stepped out in her tailored suit and designer heels, immediately regretting the choice as dust swirled around her feet. She inserted her credit card with manicured fingers, trying to complete the task as quickly as possible. That's when she saw him, a man sat propped against the wall near the station's entrance, his clothes layered despite the heat, his hair long and unkempt. A cardboard sign beside him that simply read, "Anything helps." Victoria had trained herself to walk past such scenes without engagement, not from cruelty, but from the practical understanding that she couldn't solve everyone's problems. But something about this man's posture, the way he held his head tilted slightly to the left while lost in thought, made her pause. The fuel pump clicked off, but Victoria remained frozen, staring at the figure 20 feet away. Her mind struggled to reconcile what her eyes were seeing with memories buried under decades of carefully constructed success. It couldn't be him. The statistical probability was infinitesimal. And yet the man looked up, perhaps sensing her intense gaze, and their eyes met across the dusty space. Brown eyes, still bright despite the weathered face surrounding them. Eyes that had once looked at her with such promise and passion that she'd believed anything was possible. Eyes that belonged to David Chen, the boy who had been her everything. Before life pulled them in different directions, time collapsed. Victoria was no longer a millionaire CEO, but a 17-year-old girl in Riverside, California, sitting on the hood of David's beat-up Toyota, planning a future that seemed both impossible and inevitable. They would conquer the world together, she with her business acumen, he with his brilliant engineering mind. They had sworn nothing would separate them, sealed promises with kisses that tasted like forever. David's recognition came slower, clouded by whatever circumstances had brought him to this moment. But when it hit, she saw him physically recoil, shame replacing the vacant piece of anonymity. He struggled to his feet, clearly planning to leave, but Victoria found herself moving toward him before her logical mind could intervene. Up close, the devastation was more apparent. This man who had once built robots for pure joy, who had full scholarships to MIT and Caltech, who could solve complex equations in his head faster than she could type them, this brilliant soul was living on the streets. His clothes, though worn, were arranged with a ghost of his old meticulousness. His hands, which had once drawn blueprints for impossible inventions, were now calloused and dirty from survival. They stood there, two people separated by more than just the 25 years since their last meeting. Victoria's success was written in every designer detail, while David's struggles were etched in premature lines, and the careful way he held himself, protecting old injuries. The silence stretched between them, filled with questions too large for words. Finally, Victoria gestured to her car, an invitation rather than a command. David hesitated, pride warring with practicality, but something in her expression, perhaps an echo of the girl who had believed in him, absolutely made him nod. He gathered his few possessions, moving with the efficiency of someone who had learned to pack light and leave quickly. The drive to Victoria's hotel was silent, except for the air conditioning's hum, a luxury David seemed to absorb with quiet gratitude. Victoria's mind raced through 25 years of wondering, of Google searches that yielded nothing, of dreams where he appeared to tell her he was okay, that their separation had been worth it for both their futures. The reality sitting beside her shattered every comfortable fiction she had constructed. In the hotel suite, a space larger than most homes, Victoria ordered room service while David showered. She could hear the water running for a long time, imagining him savoring the simple pleasure of hot water and privacy. When he emerged, wearing the hotel robe because his clothes needed washing, he looked simultaneously more like himself and more broken than before. They ate in careful silence, David's hunger evident despite his attempts at restraint. Victoria watched him, cataloging changes and constants. The way he still paused before eating, a grace his grandmother had taught him. The careful precision with which he cut his food, engineering mind still seeking efficiency. The new tremor in his left hand that suggested neurological damage. Each observation was a small heartbreak. After dinner, as Phoenix lights glittered beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, the story finally emerged. David spoke in fragments, as if he'd forgotten how to construct the narratives that had once flowed so easily. MAT had happened, he'd gone, excelled, graduated with honors. The future they'd dreamed of had seemed within reach. But then his younger sister was diagnosed with a rare genetic disorder. Treatments experimental and expensive. He'd taken job after job, chasing salaries that might cover medical bills. The stress led to mistakes, the mistakes to termination, the termination to worse jobs in an endless spiral. When his sister died despite everything, something in David had broken. Depression, undiagnosed and untreated, had taken the rest. Lost. Jobs became lost, apartments became lost hope, until the streets seemed like the only honest place left. Victoria listened, her own story dying unspoken in her throat. How could she tell him about her meteoric rise when every success had been built on the foundation of leaving him behind? Her parents had made the choice clear: follow David to MIT on dreams and love, or take the Stanford scholarship and the connections that came with it. At 17, she'd chosen security over passion, telling herself it was temporary, that they'd find their way back to each other. Instead, life had happened. Stanford led to Harvard Business School, which led to a startup that caught fire at exactly the right moment. Marriage to a fellow entrepreneur that lasted just long enough to be respectable. No children. She'd never found anyone who made her want to create a future the way David had. Success had come in waves, each achievement washing away more of the girl who had believed love could conquer circumstances. Now, sitting across from the man who had been her first everything, Victoria saw the cruel mathematics of their divergence. Every choice had seemed logical at the time, but the sum total was this: she had everything except what mattered, while he had lost everything, including himself. David fell asleep on the suite's couch, exhaustion overtaking him mid-sentence. Victoria covered him with a blanket, then stood at the window, Phoenix sprawling below like a circuit board of lights. She thought about the 17-year-old girl who had loved this man with every cell of her being, who had believed their connection transcended mere circumstances. That girl felt very far away, buried under layers of corporate armor. But as she watched David sleep, his face relaxing into something closer to the boy she'd known, Victoria felt those layers beginning to crack. The successful pharmaceutical CEO was just a role she'd played so long she'd forgotten it was a performance. Beneath it, the girl who had loved David Chun was still there, still 17, still believing in impossible things. The question now was whether love aged like wine or vinegar, whether connections severed could be rewired, whether two people who had become strangers to themselves could remember who they'd been to each other. As the city settled into sleep, Victoria made a decision that would either be the best or worst of her calculated life. Morning brought the harsh light of practicality. Victoria woke to find David gone, the suite empty except for a note written on hotel stationery in handwriting that transported her back to love letters hidden in school lockers. He thanked her. for dinner and shelter, but made it clear he couldn't accept more charity, especially from her. The careful dignity in his words broke her heart more than his circumstances had. Victoria knew she could let him disappear back into the anonymous masses, return to her scheduled life of board meetings and profit margins. It would be the sensible choice, the one that protected both of them from the messy work of confronting what they'd lost. But sensible choices had led them here, to a place where love had been traded for success and brilliance had been crushed by circumstance. She found him back at the gas station, as she'd known she would. Pride might move him along eventually, but David had always been a creature of habit, finding comfort in routine, even when that routine was survival. This time, Victoria came prepared, not with money or grand gestures, but with 2 cups of coffee and the willingness to sit on the cracked concrete beside him. They talked as the morning stretched toward noon. Real conversation this time, not the careful dance of the previous evening. David spoke about the physics of despair, how poverty created its own gravity that pulled everything into its orbit. Victoria shared the emptiness of success, how each achievement had felt like climbing a mountain only to discover it was just a foothill to the next peak with no summit in sight. The revelation came in pieces. David's tremor wasn't from neurological damage, but from medication lithium, when he could get it, for the bipolar disorder that had gone undiagnosed through years of struggle. The brilliant mind that had been his gift was also his curse, soaring to heights that demanded equally devastating crashes. Without insurance or consistent treatment, he'd been riding those waves alone. Victoria felt the final piece click into place. His sister's illness hadn't been the breaking point. It had been the trigger for something already waiting in his genes. The same brilliant instability that had made him see possibilities others couldn't imagine. She remembered now the weeks when he'd barely slept, creating invention after invention, followed by days when he couldn't get out of bed. At 17, she'd thought it was just his artistic temperament. At 42, she recognized the patterns her pharmaceutical empire was built on treating. The irony was staggering. Victoria had made her fortune developing mental health medications, driven by a passion she'd never fully examined. Now, sitting beside the man whose undiagnosed condition had perhaps unconsciously shaped her career, she understood the cruel, cosmic joke. She'd been trying to save him for 25 years without knowing it, but David wasn't interested in being saved, at least not in the simple way Victoria's wealth could provide. His pride, battered but not broken, wouldn't accept what felt like payment for a love that had been freely given. So Victoria proposed something different, not charity but collaboration. The partnership they'd dreamed of in youth, reconstituted for the reality of middle age. Her company had been developing a new treatment protocol, one that required long-term study participants who understood the lived experience of mental health struggles. David's insight, his ability to articulate the internal landscape of bipolar disorder with scientific precision, could be invaluable. It wasn't make work his contributions could genuinely help thousands of people riding the same devastating waves. The negotiation that followed was unlike any boardroom deal Victoria had navigated. They were bargaining with currencies more complex than money: dignity, history, the ghost of love that haunted every word. David would participate in the study, contribute to the research, receive treatment and modest compensation. But he insisted on maintaining some version of his current life, the community he'd found among Phoenix's invisible population. Over the following months, Victoria learned to see her city differently. David introduced her to the elaborate social networks that existed beneath the surface, the librarian who let people use addresses for job applications, the shelter that was really a front for a free clinic, the intricate gift economy that kept people alive when money failed. Her pharmaceutical empire began developing programs that met people where they were, not where society thought they should be. David's recovery wasn't linear. Mental health rarely followed the neat narratives Victoria's marketing department preferred. There were setbacks, moments when the medication needed adjustment, days when the weight of lost years threatened to pull him under. But there was also progress, the tremor fading, the cycles moderating, the brilliant mind emerging from the fog of survival. They fell in love again, or perhaps they simply stopped pretending they'd ever fallen out of it. But this wasn't the desperate passion of teenagers convinced they could conquer the world. This was the careful affection of people who had learned how easily love could be crushed by circumstance, who understood that connection required more than feeling it needed. Structure, support, the unsexy work of daily choice. David moved into a small apartment, refusing Victoria's offers of more. He needed space that was his walls, that didn't echo with her success. He began working part-time at the company, his insights shaping protocols that would eventually revolutionize how mental health treatment approached bipolar disorder. His name appeared on research papers, a resurrection of the academic dreams that had seemed buried forever. Victoria learned to hold success more lightly. The empire she'd built remained important, but it no longer defined her worth. She implemented policies that recognized the full spectrum of human experience, hiring practices that didn't penalize gaps in employment, benefits that covered mental health as comprehensively as physical health, partnerships with organizations that served populations. Traditional pharma ignored. The wedding, when it came, was held at the gas station where they'd reunited. Victoria's board of directors thought she'd lost her mind, but she no longer cared about their opinions. The ceremony was attended by an unlikely mix of executives in designer suits, standing beside David's friends from the streets, all united in witnessing love's strange persistence. David's vows acknowledged the lost years without bitterness, focusing instead on the unexpected gift of second chances. Victoria's admitted that success had been a poor substitute for connection, that she'd spent 25 years climbing ladders that led nowhere while the person who made her feel grounded had been falling. Together, they promised not to conquer the world. That dream belonged to younger, more naive versions of themselves, but to create small spaces of dignity and care in a world that often provided neither. Their life together wasn't a fairy tale. David's condition required constant management. Victoria's position meant navigating a corporate world that didn't understand why she'd chosen a formerly homeless man with mental health challenges over the suitable executives who'd courted her. There were difficult days when the weight of lost time felt unbearable, when they grieved for the children they might have had, the life they might have built if circumstances had been kinder. But there were also moments of profound gratitude. Watching David mentor young engineers who reminded him of himself, seeing Victoria's company transform from a profit machine into a force for genuine healing. The quiet evenings when they sat together, no longer needing to fill silence with words, understanding that love wasn't about saving each other, but about choosing to stay present through whatever waves came. The gas station became a symbol in Phoenix, eventually transformed into a community center that provided resources for mental health and homelessness. A plaque by the door read, "Sometimes we have to lose everything to find what matters." Sometimes what matters was there all along, waiting for us to stop long enough to see. 5 years after their reunion, David published a book combining memoir with scientific analysis, chronicling the intersection of brilliance and mental illness, love and loss, success and meaning. Victoria wrote the introduction, admitting that her empire had been built on running from the one thing that might have made it worthwhile: connection with the person who saw her before she became anyone worth seeing. Their story became a case study in Victoria's company training programs, an example of how love and mental health intersected in complex ways that defied simple narratives. New employees learned that behind every success story were human beings, navigating challenges that spreadsheets couldn't capture. That true innovation came from understanding the full spectrum of human experience. In the end, the millionaire woman and her childhood love created something neither could have imagined in their youthful dreams. Not the conquest of the world, but small victories over the forces that separated people from themselves and each other. Their love, tested by time and circumstance, proved that some connections transcend success or failure, that sometimes the longest journey is the one that brings us back to where we started. Changed but not broken, older but finally wise enough to recognize home.
Thank you for watching this story unfold with us here on M&A The Story Unfolds. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new tale. We'd love to know where you're watching. Leave a comment below and tell us what part of the world you're joining us from. Your support means everything. See you in the next story.